Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're going to be looking at a research paper that's causing quite a stir, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of touches on a whole bunch of hot-button issues,
Right.
academic freedom, online culture, and identity politics.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to be pretty surprised by where all this goes.
It's a wild ride.
It is. It is. So the paper, it's about the experiences of LGBTQ plus individuals in STEM fields.
Right.
But what makes it so interesting is how the researchers interpreted some of the survey responses they got.
Yeah.
Like, okay, get this. Some people identified their gender as an attack helicopter or as a gift card.
Wow.
I know, right? So how did a study like this end up getting linked to
Yeah.
like rising fascism in academia? That's what we're going to figure out.
Yeah, it's quite a journey for sure.
Yeah.
So these researchers, they're from Oregon State University, and they set out with what seemed like a pretty straightforward goal, right? To survey LGBTQ plus students in STEM about their experiences.
Okay, so far so good, right?
Yeah, pretty standard research project.
Totally.
But yeah, things took a little bit of an unexpected turn.
Okay, what happened?
So while a lot of students gave like really sincere and insightful responses,
Yeah.
a pretty big chunk of the surveys came back with what the researchers called malicious answers.
Malicious.
Yeah,
Like what?
filled with sarcasm, mockery, and a lot of references to online memes.
Oh, interesting.
So not really what the researchers were expecting.
So like instead of just straightforward answers about their experiences, they got attack helicopters.
Pretty much.
I got to admit, I'm having a little trouble seeing the connection between those kinds of responses and like something as serious as fascism.
Right.
What's the link?
So the researchers, they saw these answers, these kind of absurd answers, as more than just like off-topic humor.
Okay.
They thought they were evidence of a growing influence of what they call fascist ideologues in STEM. So basically, they believe that these responses, especially the ones using online memes and that kind of ironic humor,
Yeah.
are like a sign of a much deeper, more, I guess you could say, insidious ideology kind of seeping into these academic spaces.
So they're saying that these attack helicopter responses are actually like coded messages,
Mm-hmm.
a way of expressing extremist views, but like under the cover of humor.
That's how they're interpreting it, yeah.
Wow.
So they're drawing a connection between these responses and the rise of online hate subcultures.
Okay.
And even white nationalist movements, especially the ones that use like irony and humor to kind of mask their real intentions.
So it's like they don't really mean it, but they mean it.
Right. It's this concept sometimes called ironic bigotry.
Okay, ironic bigotry. That sounds complicated.
It is.
Could you break that down for us a little bit?
Of course.
Like, what does that even mean?
So ironic bigotry, it's basically a way to express prejudiced views without like directly saying you believe them.
Mhm.
It's like, hiding behind this veil of humor or satire
I see.
to say stuff that would otherwise be like totally unacceptable.
Okay.
So the idea is that by using irony, people can kind of get away with expressing these views,
Oh, interesting.
but they still get to keep this like plausible deniability,
Sneaky.
Yeah, and the researchers argue that this kind of bigotry, this veiled bigotry, can be just as harmful as like outright discrimination,
Oh, wow.
even if it's harder to spot and to confront.
So these students, according to the researchers,
Right.
they might be using humor and online memes to express like potentially hateful views,
Mm-hmm.
but without actually owning up to them directly.
That's essentially their argument, yeah.
Oh.
And they don't see it as just a harmless prank.
Right.
The researchers were really affected by these responses.
Yeah, I can imagine.
They reported feeling distress, even trauma.
Oh.
One transgender researcher even had to like step away from the project for a while to deal with how it affected them emotionally.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. If you're genuinely trying to conduct research to help a marginalized group
Yeah,
to be met with that kind of hostility, it's going to be really disheartening.
absolutely.
So how do they respond to this?
So this whole experience really shaped the solutions that the researchers ended up proposing.
Okay.
They started advocating for what they call social justice STEM education,
Social justice STEM education. Okay.
which is an approach that directly addresses online hate radicalization
Okay.
and how this seemingly harmless humor can actually be used to spread these really harmful ideologies.
So they think STEM education needs a major overhaul to counter this perceived rise of extremism in the field.
They believe it's essential, yeah.
Whoa.
They're also calling for a pedagogy of liberation.
Pedagogy of liberation.
Okay, that centers anti-colonial and intersectional perspectives.
Okay, so to understand this a little better,
Yeah.
let's dive into what they mean by pedagogy of liberation.
Sure.
What does that even look like, especially within a STEM field?
Okay, so essentially it's an approach to teaching and learning that emphasizes critical thinking, social justice, and the dismantling of oppressive systems.
Okay.
So in a STEM context, this might involve...
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a pretty radical shift from traditional STEM education.
Yeah.
And it sounds like something that could be pretty controversial.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, it is. It definitely is. And that's exactly what's happened.
Yeah.
This research has sparked a lot of debate
Oh, I bet.
with reactions, all over the place, from support and concern to like straight up criticism and accusations that they're overreaching.
Yeah, given how sensitive the topic is and the pretty bold claims they're making, I can imagine.
Yeah.
So, like, what are some of the main criticisms that people are leveling at the researchers in their work?
Well, one of the most common ones is about how they're interpreting the data.
Okay.
Critics argue that the researchers are kind of jumping to conclusions like they're seeing fascism behind every ironic or like jokingly phrased response. And they're saying they're attributing malicious intent where there might not be any.
So some people think the researchers are reading too much into these attack helicopter responses
Right.
and not really considering other possible explanations.
Exactly. Critics point to how common irony and meme culture is,
Yeah.
especially among younger generations.
Right.
They're saying what the researchers see as coded messages
Uh-huh.
could just be how young people talk online these days.
It's just how they talk.
Yeah, they're suggesting that students might be using humor as a way to deflect from or cope with these sensitive questions about identity,
Okay.
rather than express an actual bigotry.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm.
It does seem important to think about the cultural context of these responses
Right.
and not just jump to conclusions based on, what you already think.
Exactly.
Are there any other critiques that challenge the researchers' findings?
Yeah, there are a few. Another big one focuses on the study's methodology.
Okay.
Critics argue that the sample size was too small and not representative enough to draw these big conclusions about STEM fields as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, how many people did they even survey?
Right, they're questioning whether a few hundred responses, even if you take them at face value, can really justify saying there's a widespread rise of fascist ideologies in academia.
Yeah.
Plus, they point out that the researchers didn't really control for other things that could have affected the responses,
Like what kind of things?
like the political climate at the time.
Oh, right.
Or the specific demographics of the students they surveyed.
So basically they're saying it's methodologically flawed
Mm-hmm.
to take this limited sample and make these huge pronouncements about entire academic disciplines.
Yeah, they're saying it's potentially misleading.
Okay, that makes sense.
Hmm.
And that leads to another big point of contention, academic freedom.
Right.
You mentioned that in the intro.
Yeah.
How does that fit into all of this?
So some critics have accused the researchers of trying to stifle free speech and academic inquiry by calling any views they disagree with fascist.
Wow.
They say that kind of language is like inflammatory
Yeah.
and shuts down productive debate,
Right.
and that it could discourage open dialogue and exploring different perspectives.
So instead of creating a space for open exchange,
Right.
they're being accused of creating an environment where certain viewpoints,
Yeah.
even if they're expressed through humor or satire,
Mm-hmm.
are basically off limits and unacceptable.
That's the worry.
Wow.
Critics are concerned that labeling students with a term like fascist,
Right.
which is really loaded,
Yeah.
could have a chilling effect on academic freedom,
Yeah.
making researchers afraid to pursue certain topics.
Oh, I see.
Because they don't want to be labeled as bigoted or hateful.
That makes sense.
And they argue that this could lead to, like, a narrowing of acceptable discourse within academia,
Uh-huh.
limiting what perspectives are considered okay.
Yeah, it seems like we're walking a tightrope here.
For sure.
We want inclusive spaces, and we want to protect marginalized groups from harm.
Yeah.
But we also want to uphold free speech and open inquiry.
Mm.
How do we balance those potentially conflicting goals?
It's really tough. There's no easy answers.
Yeah.
This case shows just how hard it is to navigate these sensitive issues.
Yeah.
Especially online, where humor, satire, and bigotry can get all mixed up,
Right.
making it really hard to figure out what people really mean.
That's so true. And it raises a bigger question for me. What does this research tell us about how we understand and address online hate and extremism more broadly?
That's a great question.
Like, if we can't even agree on what counts as hate speech,
Right.
or how to interpret potentially offensive stuff online,
Yeah,
how can we actually combat these problems?
that's a crucial point. The fact that there's no consensus on how to define and deal with online hate speech makes finding effective solutions really, really hard.
For sure.
If researchers and academics are too quick to label anything they disagree with as fascist or hate speech, they risk alienating potential allies,
Right.
undermining their own credibility,
Okay.
and contributing to this culture of fear and censorship.
But on the other hand, if we just dismiss these potentially hateful expressions as harmless jokes or ironic banter,
Right.
aren't we downplaying the very real dangers of online hate speech
Exactly.
and allowing extremism to spread unchecked?
It's such a delicate balance.
Yeah.
We need to be careful about throwing around words like fascist without thinking it through.
Right.
But we also can't be naive about how online platforms can be used to spread hateful ideologies and normalize prejudice.
Totally. So, like, what's the way forward? How do we find a path that acknowledges how complex online communication is,
Right.
allows for different viewpoints, and still takes the threat of online hate and extremism seriously?
That is the million-dollar question. It's complicated and it requires a multifaceted approach.
Okay.
But I think one crucial step is recognizing that the online world, just like the offline world, is full of nuances, ambiguities, and shades of gray.
So we need to move beyond these simplistic binaries
Exactly.
and engage in more nuanced thinking.
Yes. Instead of jumping to conclusions,
Okay.
we need to be willing to engage in thoughtful, critical analysis of what we see online, considering the context, the
Yeah.
intent,
Yep.
and the potential impact of different ways of communicating.
So we need better tools for understanding and evaluating online discourse.
Yes, and that means more than just developing algorithms
Okay.
or content moderation policies.
So what else does it involve?
It means cultivating critical thinking skills,
Oh, yeah.
promoting media literacy, and fostering a culture of open, respectful dialogue.
Even when we're dealing with views we find offensive or that we don't agree with?
Exactly.
That sounds like a tall order.
It is.
Where do we even start to implement such big changes?
Well, there are a lot of potential starting points.
Okay.
Educational institutions have a huge role to play. In equipping students with the critical thinking skills and media literacy, they need to navigate all the complexities of online communication.
So this isn't just about STEM education.
Right.
We need to cultivate critical thinking and media literacy across all disciplines and educational levels.
Absolutely. We need to teach students not just what to think, but how to think.
How to think.
Yeah, how to evaluate information,
Okay.
identify bias,
Uh-huh.
and engage in constructive dialogue.
Even when they encounter viewpoints they disagree with.
Exactly.
And maybe even more importantly, how to engage with those disagreements respectfully and constructively.
Yes. We need to move away from this culture of outrage and polarization
Yeah.
and towards a culture of empathy, understanding, and reasoned debate.
Okay, but how do we create that kind of culture shift
Right.
in a world that seems to reward the loudest and most extreme voices?
It's definitely a challenge,
Yeah.
but I believe it's essential.
Go.
And it starts with each of us taking responsibility for our own online behavior, modeling the kind of respectful and thoughtful engagement we want to see in others.
So it's not just about top-down solutions
Right.
or institutional changes.
It's about individual responsibility
Yeah.
and a collective commitment to creating a healthier online environment.
Exactly.
And that's something we'll delve into further in the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
where we'll explore some potential strategies for moving forward
Sounds good.
and addressing the complex challenges this research has brought up and all the debate it's sparked.
This deep dive has been, well, a pretty thought-provoking journey, I'd say. And it's clear we've just barely scratched the surface of this really complex, multifaceted issue. But I think you've given us some really valuable insights and strategies for, navigating these tricky waters.
Well, I hope so. And I want to emphasize that this is an ongoing conversation. We need to keep exploring these issues,
All right.
keep challenging our assumptions, and work together to build a digital world that's both vibrant and inclusive, where different perspectives can thrive and hate and extremism just have no place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So beyond just acknowledging the complexity, what are some concrete strategies we can use to put this nuanced understanding into practice.
Yeah.
What can we do as individuals and as a society to create a healthier and more productive online environment?
It's a multifaceted challenge, so it needs a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
One crucial area we need to focus on, as we've talked about, is education.
Right. You mentioned how important it is to develop critical thinking skills and media literacy,
Yeah.
but how do we go beyond just talking about it and actually make it a meaningful part of our education system?
It's not about adding another course to an already packed curriculum.
Right.
It's about fundamentally changing how we approach teaching and learning across all subjects, from STEM fields to the humanities and social sciences.
So it's about building a culture of inquiry, critical analysis, and reasoned debate, not just memorizing facts or mastering technical skills.
Exactly. We need to give students the tools to evaluate information critically, identify bias and manipulation, and engage with different perspectives respectfully, even when they come across viewpoints that challenge their own.
That sounds great in theory, but how do we actually make this happen? How do we shift from a traditional education model that often focuses on rote memorization to one that truly embraces critical thinking and open dialogue?
It requires a shift in both mindset and teaching methods. We need to stop seeing education as just a one-way street where knowledge goes from teacher to student,
Okay.
and instead embrace a more collaborative and inquiry-based approach.
Like what?
Imagine classrooms where students are encouraged to ask tough questions, debate different perspectives, and learn from each other's insights.
I mean, that sounds like a much more engaging and dynamic learning environment, but also potentially more chaotic and difficult for teachers to manage.
It can be, yeah, and it requires a willingness to be okay with a certain level of ambiguity and discomfort. But real learning and growth often happen in those uncomfortable moments. And through those challenging conversations, students develop the critical thinking skills and empathy they need to navigate a complex world.
So you're basically advocating for a complete overhaul of our current education system.
Not necessarily a complete overhaul, but a significant shift in what we emphasize.
Okay.
We need to move away from a model that prioritizes standardization and conformity and embrace an approach that's more personalized and student-centered, one that values creativity, critical thinking, and the ability to engage in thoughtful and respectful dialogue.
That makes sense, and it definitely fits with the bigger goals we've been discussing. Creating a more inclusive and less polarized online space where people can interact with each other in a more nuanced and productive way. But education is only one piece of the puzzle, right? What other strategies can we use to tackle the problems of online hate and extremism?
Education is definitely the foundation, but we also need to look at how technology itself shapes our online experiences. Social media platforms and other online spaces have a responsibility to create environments that encourage healthy communication and discourage the spread of hate speech and misinformation.
So things like content moderation policies,
Yeah.
algorithms that promote quality content,
Right.
maybe even redesigning platforms to encourage more constructive engagement.
Exactly. All of those are important. But it's not just about what platforms do, it's also about how we as users interact with them.
So individual responsibility is crucial too.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of our own online behavior, the language we use, the content we share, and how we interact with others.
It's easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment online, especially with sensitive or controversial topics. Do you have any practical advice for handling these tough situations?
A few basic guidelines can make a big difference. First, before you post or comment, just pause for a second and think.
Okay.
Ask yourself, is this constructive? Is it respectful? Will it contribute to a productive conversation, or am I just going to add fuel to the fire?
So take a breath and think before you hit send. Good advice, but sometimes harder to do than it sounds. What else can we do to encourage more thoughtful online engagement?
Another important strategy is to focus on understanding rather than just trying to win an argument. Try to see things from the other person's perspective, even if you don't agree with them.
Right.
Ask questions to clarify, listen actively, and try to find some common ground.
That sounds much more productive than just getting into a shouting match or resorting to personal attacks. What about when people are clearly spreading hateful or harmful content? Is dialogue even possible then?
There are definitely times when dialogue isn't appropriate, especially when you're dealing with people or groups who are actively promoting violence, hate speech, or other harmful behavior.
Right.
In those situations, it's important to report that content to the right authorities.
Okay.
And take steps to protect yourself and others.
So dialogue and understanding are key.
Yes.
But we also need to realize that conversation alone can only go so far, and that sometimes we need to take stronger action to ensure safety and prevent harm.
Exactly. It's about finding the right balance between engaging in good faith dialogue when you can and taking a stand against hate and extremism when you need to.
Hmm.
And that takes discernment, courage, and a commitment to creating a more just and equitable online world.
This deep dive has really given us a lot to think about, and we've obviously only just scratched the surface of a really complex issue. But you've given us some valuable insights and strategies to navigate these challenges.
I hope so. And I just want to reiterate that this conversation needs to continue. We need to keep exploring these issues, challenging our own assumptions, and working together to create a digital world that's both dynamic and inclusive, a place where different perspectives can thrive and where hate and extremism have absolutely no place.
Couldn't said it better myself. And on that note, this wraps up our deep dive for today.
Great talking to you.
Likewise. But as you said, the conversation doesn't stop here. We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, seek out different viewpoints, and most importantly, engage in thoughtful and respectful dialogue, both online and offline. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.